Welcome one and welcome all to the PFN Fantasy Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Tate. You can find me over at Derek Tate NFL over on X. That is the one and only Kyle Soppe. You can find him over at Kyle Soppe PFN over on X, formerly known as Twitter. Hey, we're entering week 2. It's Thursday. We're recording. We have got a DFS slate on the docket for you DFS enthusiasts here on the PFN Fantasy YouTube channel as well as our podcast. But Soppe, got to talk, man. I mean, we got some news and notes that we're going to jump into in here in just a second. How did you do? How did your DFS lineups do in week number 1? Just out of curiosity.
It's funny because the more confident I am in these DFS lineups, sometimes the more sideways it goes. I was average last week. Like I cashed some of my cash games, didn't really move the needle at all in GPPs or bigger contests, which is a little bit of a letdown. I thought Jalen Waddle would have a bigger day. He was fine. But if that 80-yard touchdown goes to him instead of Tyreek, we're having a completely different discussion. Maybe I'm not here because I'm spending money off somewhere, but that didn't happen. So I wasn't printing the money like what I'd like to do this week. How about you?
Did all right with Baker Mayfield and
That'll do it.
Yeah, Baker Mayfield, Mike Evans, and Chris Godwin. Where I missed was Malik Neighbors. Malik Neighbors was in pretty much a lot of my lineups, and then sprinkled some Drake London in there, which was even worse. So it could have been better, but had some hits, made a little bit of money. Sure. That's what it's all about here. And then we're gonna be talking about our favorite week 2 DFS lineups. Let's jump into some news and notes real quick here, just because we're obviously dropping 3 episodes a week for the PFN Fantasy Podcast. So we already know that Raheem Mostert is ruled out for Thursday Night Football. Devon Achane is a game-time decision. We talked about that on the previous episode. But Kenneth Walker misses practice on Wednesday with an oblique injury. And it's a little uncertain how limited he is, but his absence from practice, Soppe, does certainly make you raise a little bit of an eyebrow because we would like to see him available against the New England Patriots and what we expect could be a nice game script for any leading back for the Seattle Seahawks. So obviously Zach Charbonnet kind of enters the fray as a guy that would instantly see his fantasy value jump in week 2 if Kenneth Walker's unavailable, correct?
Yeah, I think Charbonnet would move into the low end running back 2 range as it stands right now. And I'm going to assume Kenneth Walker is active until proven otherwise. I understand he's being rested right now. You take that for what it is. It's week 1 going into week 2. They don't want to put too much stress on a guy that's missed time throughout his career. So I'm not raising any red flags yet, and I've still got Kenneth Walker inside my top 15 and Charbonnet outside my top 30 because that's how I think this is going to go. But if Charbonnet is, in fact, the lead back, I understand New England's defense is stout, but you're talking, like you said, positive game script, a guy that we think is reasonably versatile and talented. He'd be inside my top 25.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. When it came to the explosiveness we saw from Walker, and we've seen it throughout his NFL career, but really how dominant he was as far as touches in week number 1 is highly encouraging for his rest of season outlook because 66% of the snaps, even with the injury to Charbonnet's 33%. So if Walker gets back on the practice field and is active against the Patriots, I'm thinking he's a top 15, if not a borderline top 10 play against New England in week number 2. So we also want to touch on real quick, Puka Nacua to IR. So he is out a minimum of the next 4 games. Seems like it could be even longer than that, Soppe. So when it comes to this Los Angeles offense, obviously a huge piece is missing now. And we saw the inverse last year with how dominant Puka Nacua was to start the season when Cooper Kupp was out of the lineup for the first 4 weeks. So do we just go ahead and flip that and kind of make Cooper Kupp? Where do you have him in your rankings? Because I have him as the wide receiver 1 this week against the Arizona Cardinals.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's crazy. I've got him at 4. He was, what was he? Wide receiver 24 6 days ago, and now he's all the way up inside the top 5. It's the nature of the beast here. It's a very concentrated offense that we are comfortable betting on Matthew Stafford. Like, he's a wide receiver god all the way back to Calvin Johnson, all that good stuff. I mean, we saw Puka, you mentioned it, in this spot, 35 targets through the first 2 weeks of last season. Cooper Kupp, 21 last week. He's on a pretty good trajectory there. So, yeah, I think he's the option. If you're going to go with a wide receiver 2, there's a few options. You've got Johnson, you've got Robinson. I'm more on Robinson. You guys talked about Johnson the other day. I think you're kind of grasping at straws because, like we said, he hones in on his guys, and his guys are Kupp and Nacua. Without Nacua there, I don't think you can just slide in Robinson and say, oh, yeah, that's 8 to 10 targets. So it's Kyron, it's Cooper, and it's nothing else for me in LA.
So the thing that's very encouraging, why I'm so aggressive with a wide receiver 1 ranking, which we'll get to him here in a second, because he is somebody that's going to make an appearance on this episode for week number 2 for the DFS slate. Look, Stafford only averaged 5.9 air yards per passing attempt in week 1. And part of the reason why is because their offensive line, Soppe, is pretty banged up, and they were unable to get ahead of the sticks. I think Kyron Williams averaged under 3 yards per carry, and he was the only back to really see any meaningful work in week number 1. So if they can't run the ball at an efficient clip, sure, Williams will still see the volume, but I think they're going to rely on the quick passing game. And Soppe, it's pretty clear who he's going to get heavily involved in that quick passing game, and that is Cooper Kupp. So I'm very, very bullish for Cooper Kupp in week number 2. So let's move on and touch on real quick the Denver Broncos backfield. I know that you were more of a Javonte Williams guy. I was more of a Jaleel McLaughlin guy. They both had very disappointing debuts in an offense that had a rookie quarterback making his starting debut in front of the 12th man there in Seattle, including a revamped defense from defensive coordinator Mike McDonald, well, new head coach and great defensive coordinator Mike McDonald in his head coaching debut there in Seattle. And it was just a rough day at the office. But Audric Estime, a very big, talented rookie from Notre Dame, he has been sent to IR, so he is out of the lineup for the next 4 games. Obviously, they let go of Samaje Perine ahead of the season. Maybe they promote Blake Watson, but honestly, this looks like a backfield where it's going to be Javonte Williams and Jaleel McLaughlin. Does this move the needle for either of them significantly with Estime going to IR?
Not in a crazy way, because I as high as I was on this backfield coming in, there's no denying that this doesn't run out too well. You mentioned neither looked really all that good. The 2 backups lost fumbles, and Javonte Williams wasn't really doing anything last week. You've got the Steelers this week, your Bucks, who we'll touch on during this podcast the week after that, and then the Jets. I don't think this offense is going anywhere in a hurry. Bo Nix is going to have his ups and downs, and when the ups are there, I don't doubt that Javonte Williams can have his moments, and maybe McLaughlin too. But right now, I mean, they're concentrated. They'll get touches. I'm just not sure how valuable those touches are going to be while Estime is on IR.
Yeah, it doesn't move the needle as significantly. Not much has changed until we see any positive signs from this backfield. The only thing that was positive for McLaughlin was how much he was involved and how many touches he got in comparison to Estime, to Javonte Williams. Williams still outsnapped McLaughlin, but it was something where it looked like the 2 clear factors in this backfield are clearly established with Javonte Williams and Jaleel McLaughlin. Just going to kind of wait and see. I don't think either of these guys are more than just a running back 3 dart throw flex play entering week number 2. So let's move on. We got to build our DFS slate for week number 2. Soppe, and who is your favorite week 2 bounce back that will not be mentioned later in this episode?
Yeah, I think you've got a few options here. Marvin Harrison comes to mind, guys like that. I'm gonna go that direction. I think it's low-hanging fruit, but he was out on the field plenty. He's running the routes. He's the talent we thought he was. I'm willing to be patient here. It's a layup answer, and I'm gonna take it just because I don't know how many options we're gonna get like that, where he's coming off a week with almost as many yards as targets. Like that's not a good way to start your career. I'm no big-time data scientist here, but if that's going to be the case, he's in for a long fantasy season. The Cardinals still put points on the board. Kyler Murray is healthy and looks good to me. I'm going to trust Marvin Harrison and keep him as a top 15 receiver.
So I understand going that route. I know you're holding the line when it comes to Marvin Harrison Jr. It was a disappointing debut for sure. Yeah. But you think that the talent is there. You expect his role to expand. I expect the market to correct itself a bit for them to maybe go out of their way to get the ball to the number 4 overall pick in the 2024 NFL draft. For me, it's the San Francisco 49ers passing offense. They faced off against the Jets, but Soppe, one of the things that was most encouraging, they generated 8 straight scoring drives against this New York Jets defense. And this is arguably the best secondary in the NFL. And there was a drop by Brandon Ayuk on a beautiful ball from Brock Purdy. And I'm not killing Brandon Ayuk or anything like that. I mean, he hasn't, obviously the whole contract squabble kept him off the football field for the majority of the preseason, but they're going up against a Minnesota Vikings defense that wants to bring pressure. And the way that we saw Deebo Samuel deployed in week 1, the way that I believe Brandon Ayuk can be very effective against this Minnesota secondary, in a San Francisco offense that I understand Purdy didn't light it up from a fantasy perspective in week 1 against the Jets, but I think he's going to have a lot more fantasy success against this hyper-aggressive Minnesota Vikings defense in week number 2. So I would triple stack. I feel very comfortable triple stacking this entire Niners passing attack with Purdy, Ayuk, Samuel. But if this is probably a little bit more of a tweak because Samuel and Ayuk aren't exactly cheap options. If Christian McCaffrey is available in this contest, then I'll go with Purdy and Ayuk. If McCaffrey is unavailable, I will go with Purdy and Samuel because of his 5 carries on Monday Night Football in week 1 without McCaffrey in the lineup. Either way, I don't think you can go wrong with the San Francisco offense in week number 2 through the air against this hyper-aggressive Minnesota Vikings defense. Any thoughts on that suggestion with the San Francisco 49ers and Brock Purdy himself?
No, I like it. I think Ayuk's a pretty clean stack, whereas Debo could get a little in the weeds here if he's taking handoffs. Obviously, it's not as functional of a DFS stack because you're not getting the double points from Purdy to Debo. So in a perfect world, you get McCaffrey back, you go with Ayuk, but I don't think you can go wrong with San Fran. That's a solid buy.
So let's go ahead and speaking of stacks, let's go ahead and jump into our quarterback, wide receiver, tight end stacks that we like for week number 2. Soppe, who really jumps out to you on this Sunday slate?
Yeah, it's going to be a bounce back option that I didn't mention in the first question here. I think it's got to be Goff and Amon-Ra St. Brown for me going against your Buccaneers. It's a game I think we both have pegged for high expectations in this spot. Amon-Ra has to bounce back off of the poor showing, but I think most people are going to see the Bucs. They're going to realize it's a good pass funnel situation. They're a top 5 defense when it comes to EPA over the last year, but bottom 5 when it comes to passer rating, yards per attempt, and yards per slot completion after the catch. And that's where Amon-Ra is going to exploit them. Jameson Williams was great, and he's going to be great because he's a very special football player, but I think that's going to generate some FOMO. People missed out because he was on a primetime slate, and they're going to throw him in there. And then that kind of excludes you from putting Amon-Ra in your lineup unless you're really tripling down. So that gets me off that leverage. He's a lot cheaper. He's a good buy. Don't get me wrong. But if I'm getting off of Jameson Williams to be different with a guy I think is one of the top 5 receivers in the game, give me that every day of the week. Tampa Bay brings the heat. We know they blitz plenty. Amon-Ra St. Brown, since the beginning of last season, 30% over expectation against the blitz in terms of fantasy points. I'm taking this to the bank. I'm starting every lineup with this duo and then differentiating elsewhere.
You mentioned all those reasons. Certainly you have my stamp of approval, in particular because of all the injuries to that Tampa Bay secondary. I mentioned some of them on yesterday's podcast here on the PFN Fantasy podcast YouTube channel. Check it out, like, subscribe, all this stuff. But, when it comes to Antoine Winfield Jr., who's an all-pro safety and that kind of anchors the back end of that defense, that already kind of is boom or bust with how aggressive and how much Todd Bowles likes to heat up opposing quarterbacks. If he's not back there, that is a potentially bad situation, in particular with Zion McCollum, who had a concussion in week number 1. He's the starting corner opposite of Jamel Dean. We don't know what his status is for this contest. If he is out, which is very reasonable, they could have a lot of issues, including losing Bryce Hall, who is their depth piece, along with like Tyke Smith and Christian Izien. This is a really banged up secondary who struggles to get after the quarterback unless they bring pressure, Soppe. And it's only a matter of time. Sure, maybe they get home on a blitz or 2, but this is one of the better offensive lines in the league. Amon-Ra St. Brown going up against a banged up secondary. There's a lot to like about Amon-Ra having a major bounce back performance, including last year where he torched this exact Bucs secondary over 100 yards and a score in their regular season matchup. I'm all on board with the Goff and Amon-Ra St. Brown stack. I'm going to go to the other side, though. I'm completely fine going with Baker Mayfield. And sure, if you're skeptical about his 289 yards and 4 touchdown passes against the Washington Commanders' leaky secondary and don't think it's for real, that's fine. But do we just mention that the Lions are probably going to have a lot of success against this Bucs secondary? That equals a high-scoring game on the road. And last year in the postseason matchup, Soppe, Baker Mayfield threw for over 300 yards and 2 scores. Sure, he turned the ball over a little bit too, but they're willing to air it out. And that's what it looked like in week number 1. They ran 3 receiver sets at an 84% or 82% clip. That was the 4th highest in the NFL. And we saw a lot of 11 personnel against this Lions secondary in week number 1 because the Rams literally ran 3 receiver sets, 11 personnel, 1 tight end, 1 running back on 100% of their snaps. So, and Stafford, even without Puka Nacua and a banged up offensive line, he still threw for over 300 yards. So if Stafford can do it, and we've seen Baker do it last time we saw him in the postseason in a high scoring affair, and the addition of Jalen McMillan, who I think adds a very nice third piece alongside Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. If you want to stack Baker and Evans, go ahead. If you want to stack Baker and Godwin, go ahead. If you really want to go off the slate and have a nice, really cheap option down the board, McMillan's only $3,600, and he could have scored 2 or 3 touchdowns in the opener against the Washington Commanders, and he was on the field the most of any Buccaneers wide receiver in week number 1. So I think all 3 of these guys are nice options, and Baker at sub $6,000 on DraftKings, I think really has another chance to potentially finish this Sunday slate as one of the top options at quarterback. Am I crazy? Do you think I'm being a Bucs homer?
No, I don't think that's crazy at all. Everything we've seen in Detroit's profile suggests that this could happen. My only concern here is because of the price tag and some of the cheap options there, that he might be a little chalky. We saw him put up, I grade these quarterbacks on a week-to-week basis. He got a 95 score. That might be the highest we see all season. He did it in the first week. So that's my only concern. A little bit of a rubber band here. I went with the bring back. I slid Chris Godwin into my lineup as well. So I'm with you in thinking that this game clears 50 points. And if that's going to be the case, I want 3, if not 4 pieces of it.
The off the radar stack that could be worth it if you're really wanting to go against the grain because of what we saw from the New York Giants in week number 1, Daniel Jones and Malik Neighbors, or possibly even Wan'Dale Robinson against this leaky secondary. Soppe, if this defense is as bad as what we saw in week number 1, there is a world where Daniel Jones, if there's ever a time, and Malik Neighbors for them to go off, it could be in week number 2. I'm not going to trust it with some of the other options with Goff and Baker like we just talked about, but maybe it's worth a consideration.
Yeah, let's stay on that game and skip ahead a little bit here. This is my goofy game special of the week. I'm not going the Daniel Jones route, and I don't love going with Jaden Daniels because I don't know how you stack him. Is he going to go to Terry McLaurin, anything like that? I'm going to say that I know how this game's going to go. I'm going to say that Washington's leading, which, is dangerous a sentence you could possibly say, and New York's playing catch up. If that's going to be the case, there's going to be a lot of Brian Robinson, and there's going to be a lot of Daniel Jones throwing from behind, which is going to go to Malik Neighbors. So I've got a mini little stack with those 2 to go along with my Lions game stack. I mean, you look at Brian Robinson, looked great last week, could have had another touchdown, but he scored over 80 yards in total. The Giants' second in blitz rate since the beginning of last season. How do you beat that when you've got a rookie quarterback? I'm looking at some dump offs. I'm looking at some break one tackle and bust a big play. Robinson, one of the best at doing that after contact since week 10 of last season. Better than Pacheco, better than Kenneth Walker when it comes to percentage of carries that gain at least 5 yards. So if he can get to that second level, there might not be a third level waiting for him. And if he's putting points on the board, that means Malik Neighbors and company going to have to come from behind. Over the last year, we've seen 11 of the best 17 receiver performances come against the Bucs. They saw less than 30% of their routes come in the slot. So they're on the perimeter. They're making plays, and that's where Neighbors was in his NFL debut. And they really can't stop anybody when it comes to these top-notch receivers. The targets against the Giants or against the Bucs, against the Commanders, goodness, generally go where you're expecting them to, and I would expect that to be the case here. I'm not buying Wan'Dale Robinson sucking in 35% of their targets or whatever it was again. Neighbors going to see 10 targets. He's going to go off. Brian Robinson is going to repeat what he did last week, and you're going to be able to get a lot of value out of a game that has no interest.
So it's interesting as you mentioned about Wan'Dale Robinson because of the sheer fact that the Minnesota Vikings maybe gave us an answer to the test of how to, well, outside of just relying on Daniel Jones to be Daniel Jones, to slow down this Giants offense is to double and bracket. Malik Neighbors, they ran brackets at the highest clip of any defense in the NFL in week number 1 at 5.9% of their defensive snaps, which means that they're already in his rookie debut. NFL defense is allocating extra resources to slow down Malik Neighbors. Problem is, those resources in Washington, I don't think they're going to be able to slow him down.
Yeah.
So we'll find out. That is a weird game, and that's an interesting one to hone in on. For me, it's the Cleveland Browns and the Jacksonville Jaguars is a very interesting game to try to figure out, because Jerome Ford had a top 10 running back week 1 debut in full PPR formats. It was a garbage time touchdown, had a lot of receptions underneath. It was a blowout. Watson kept dropping back, but the stack of Amari Cooper and Deshaun Watson against this secondary that, saw Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle go for over 100 yards receiving. It does intrigue me a little bit. I understand Watson was terrible, but David Njoku's hurt. So that removes one potentially, target earner in this offense. I don't have any confidence Elijah Moore is going to, he's on the field a bit, but he doesn't really do much with his snaps and targets. So Amari Cooper dropped a touchdown on a beautiful route. Amari Cooper can still route up any cornerback in the NFL. I believe that the target share is going to jump in this contest because, Soppe, when you take a look at this Jacksonville run defense, they held Devon Achane to 2.4 yards per carry. They held Raheem Mostert to 1.5 yards per carry. They combined for, get this, 16 carries for 33 yards.
That's 1 carry for Achane last year.
Wow. Yeah, right. I mean, it is an average of 7.2 yards per carry or whatever it was. The Jacksonville run defense is something that I'm actually thinking is probably look like a vastly improved unit. So I don't know what we're going to get from Jerome Ford as far as efficiency on the ground, which makes me think that Deshaun Watson's going to have to go to the air to generate points. Now, will they? Who knows? But I do think that this Jacksonville secondary is susceptible to some big performances, which has me at least looking at Amari Cooper. If you don't want to stack them with Watson, I'm okay with that. But at least take a look at Amari Cooper from this contest. And on the flip side, the Cleveland secondary, I get it. They're a very talented unit and they're dominant. They actually didn't do a bad job bottling up CeeDee Lamb in week number 1, but they run a lot of cover 1, Soppe, which is man coverage with a single high safety, and then a lot of cover 3. And I just think that if you're going to try to ask these corners who are very talented, but we just saw Brian Thomas Jr. potentially almost catch a 40-yard touchdown pass against Jalen Ramsey. So I think that Brian Thomas Jr. and Trevor Lawrence is a stack that is probably going to have low ownership because of the matchup, but I still think can have some success in week number 2.
My only question for you there is how many points total are going to be scored in this game? Like, I like to stack in games that could get up and get going. That thing's dealing with a total right around 41. That's a little dangerous for a quarterback wide receiver stack. I understand that I just picked the Giants and Commanders for a mini stack, and it's not like they're gonna score 65 points out here. But I would take the upside there that the quarterbacks can at least in both of our games realistically make enough mistakes to put the other offense in scoring position without them really doing anything right. It scares me a little bit. If I was going to go with the Browns, it would be Cooper, but it'd be Cooper alone. I'm not right now interested in betting on Deshaun Watson.
No one is, but I'm trying. You said a weird game. The Jacksonville-Cleveland one feels like kind of a weird one to try to even diagnose, but I do see some potential signs that Cooper and maybe even Brian Thomas Jr. could have nicer days than expected. Let's shift to the running back position, though. Soppe, some interesting options. We got some answers to the tests with how some of these backfields may be split up moving forward and into week number 2. So what running backs or one specifically really stands out for this week 2 slate?
Yeah, I think you can go down the board as much as you want, but this thing is going to be decided at the tippy top of the board, in my opinion, if you're deciding between Jonathan Taylor or Kyren Williams. And I think that's going to kind of divide the results, if you will, for the DFS slates. Obviously, your game, what game you pick to play and all that stuff is going to impact your decision-making here. But I think that both these guys are going to garner quite a bit of ownership, and I would bet on one of them outshining the other by a decent amount. It's just a matter of nailing it. And I think Jonathan Taylor is the play here. Nothing against Kyren Williams, but he's got Cooper Kupp to deal with. We don't exactly have that in Indy. I understand Anthony Richardson's more of a threat, obviously, than Matthew Stafford to do anything. But this is a great spot. Jonathan Taylor on the field for over 95% of the snaps in week 1. That was the second highest rate of his career. He's the alpha. He is everything they want him to be. And the bombs from Anthony Richardson were great. They make for great video clips, great social media, all that stuff. That's not the most sustainable way to go about living, but I think they're going to be in a positive game script against the Packers team that, without Jordan Love, I mean, I don't know how you can have much optimism. Coming into the season, Green Bay was a 4.5-point favorite in this game. Now they're a 3-point underdog. That kind of tells you where we're going here with the Malik Willis experience. And I expect a little bit of an overreaction, to be honest with you, when it comes to ownership on Jonathan Taylor. You're still talking a highly priced running back. He had no big runs last week. He had no targets last week. I don't think that's going to be the norm here. And since the beginning of last season, Green Bay is a blitz-heavy team, 6th in blitz rate over that stretch. And we've seen the ADOT of opposing quarterbacks in recent years here trend lower against the blitz. So if we're getting a screen pass or two, Jonathan Taylor ends up with, 6-7 points as a PPR asset out of the backfield on top of what I expect to be 15, 18, 20 carries in the running game. I think he's going to score. You get the 100-yard bonus, all that good stuff. Jonathan Taylor is locked into my lineups here as the number 1 running back, and I think it's head-to-head. Him and Kyron, pick right there. I think you're in a good spot to make some money in week 2.
So one of the reasons why I'm leaning towards going Jonathan Taylor over Kyron Williams for my running back 1 overall, I'm putting him all the way at the top of my rankings in week number 2, strictly because of the things that you mentioned, the concerns about the Green Bay offense and how this is going to look and how productive they're going to be. How are they going to be able to sustain drives with Malik Willis if he's incapable of being able to get through at least 1 read, if not 2, before just trying to run around and make something happen with his legs on 3rd down situations? Because I mean, Josh Jacobs also was limited in practice with a back injury, and sure, maybe we see more of Wilson in that backfield, and maybe Marshawn Lloyd is able to get on the field for week number 2. But I have a lot of questions about this Packers offense and how it's going to be able to generate points in week number 2. I trust Matt LaFleur. I just don't trust Malik Willis. So if that's the case, and you mentioned the vertical passing attack, and while there is some intrigue with maybe Anthony Richardson and stacking him with one of those deep threats, whether it is Adonai Mitchell or Alec Pierce in DFS, that is another potential play. But, is there a world where Green Bay overcompensates and tries to make Anthony Richardson work his way down the football field? And if that's the case, we also just saw Saquon Barkley go for over 100 yards rushing, over 120 total yards, and 3 scores against this Green Bay defense. And you mentioned already, no other running back touched the ball there in Indianapolis in week number 1. He was the only running back to see a touch. And I think, maybe somebody else gets sprinkled in with a heavier workload, but expect Jonathan Taylor in a game script that is probably going to be very favorable for a lead back in a plus level matchup who has explosive playmaking capability. Soppe, I'm 100% on board with you here with Jonathan Taylor in this DFS slate. I do think he's worth paying up as a top dollar option. So in that case, I'm going to pivot a little bit and go a little bit down the board to J.K. Dobbins at Carolina. I'm just over $5,000, Soppe. And all those game script concerns, all those favorable game script elements that we are projecting for Jonathan Taylor, I'm doing the same exact thing for J.K. Dobbins against this Carolina offense that is certainly struggling. Their struggles from last year continued into week number 1 against the New Orleans Saints. And the Los Angeles Chargers defense looked a little bit better than I thought against the Las Vegas Raiders in week number 1. But we talked about this split on a previous episode earlier this week when it comes to J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards. And, Dobbins was the player that was on the field more. He was the more efficient, more explosive ball carrier. We saw that he looked like the better option when healthy during their time in Baltimore when they were on the same offense, same roster. And that's what it looked like for me when it comes to Dobbins and Gus Edwards. So in a game where I think that the Carolina Panthers are going to struggle to score points, and the Panthers struggle to slow down opposing rushing attacks, Soppe. They just lost Derek Brown, and Kamara went nuts, had 4.4 yards per carry or yards before contact per attempt in week number 1 on 15 carries. That was his average contact per attempt before he was touched. There's too many things to like. This team wants to run the football, and I think they're going to be able to with great success throughout the entire contest against the Carolina Panthers. I think that if you want to take a chance on Gus Edwards too, that's fine. Just get a piece of this Chargers backfield for this DFS slate.
That sounds like less of a Chargers thing and more of a whoever's playing Carolina thing, which I don't really have a problem at all with. You're higher on J.K. Dobbins this week than I am, but I'm not gonna poo-poo that play at all. This is fascinating to me because we have two very different structures to our lineup. I want to go head-to-head with you this week. We'll put our lineups against one another just to see how this plays out. You're going back to the well with some guys that shined last week, thinking that they're still underpriced and can do more of the same. I'm going the complete opposite with guys that bombed last week, and I think they're going to go off this week. So it'll be interesting to see kind of who gets this right with two very different builds, but I think they're reasonable plays. I'm not going to say going J.K. Dobbins against the Panthers team that you said they were bad at stopping the run, bad at making contact, they're bad at football, Derek. You could spin it however, like I'm as guilty of it as anybody is putting stats in there. They are a bad football team at every level of every side of the ball.
Yeah, and losing Derek Brown, their best defensive tackle, that for the season, that does not help. That is not going to help slow down any rushing attack, in particular one with Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman as the OC. They're going to run the ball early, often, and always, in particular this week. So let's move on. Another play that I did want to mention really quick, Soppe, at the running back position that kind of intrigues me. And if you have another one that intrigues you, you mentioned Kyren Williams. I'm also really taking a closer look at Najee Harris this week. We saw some concerning usage for, Austin Eckler, a guy who reminds me a lot of Austin Eckler and Jaylen Warren. Clearly, I don't think that he's 100% healthy. He just wasn't on the field very often. And if that's going to be the case against a Denver defense that just allowed Kenneth Walker to go for over 100 yards and the offense struggled to put up points, the Pittsburgh Steelers defense looked outstanding against the Atlanta Falcons and Kirk Cousins. The Denver Broncos offense doesn't have that type of juice, and Nick's had more bad moments than good moments in his debut. 20 carries in week number 1 for Najee Harris, a very fairly priced option, I think, at the running back position in a game script that feels, again, could be quite favorable for Najee in week number 2.
Yeah, if I'm going to go an off-the-board kind of option, I'd go Zach Moss against the Chiefs. I don't think he's going to be very popular. He does play in the second wave of games, which is very, very light this week. Only 3 games after that 1 o'clock window. So this gives you some leverage to change. You can see how your lineup's going, how everything is playing out in your standings. And if Zach Moss is a good leverage play, great. If you need more upside, Javonte Williams is sitting there for you at a low-owned price against the Steelers. You can go that direction. But Zach Moss certainly seemed like the guy in Cincinnati's backfield. We know they're going to have to keep Kansas City off the field if they're going that direction. I'm confident he gets the short yardage touches. In the scope of the slate, I don't love Zach Moss, but from a strategic setup, a DFS lineup point of view, I don't mind going that direction with the late kickoff.
Nothing like making the suggestion, hey, put this player in your lineup so you could potentially change him later. No, no, I'm kidding, Soppe. I understand the thought process for sure. So let's focus on the defensive side. You know, some intriguing options. Again, the Green Bay Packers having to start Malik Willis in week number 2. That is certainly makes the Indianapolis Colts an intriguing option. The Carolina Panthers offense showed very little signs of life, even a pulse in week number 1. So that makes the Chargers defense potentially in play. Who are some of the defensive matchups, and maybe who's your defensive play of the week that you're going to say with your chest and conviction to enter in your lineup?
See, this is where I'm going to separate you from our head-to-head contest here. We're going to be pretty close up and down the stretch. You've got some guys who are targeting the same game as a stack. This is where Soppe distances himself from Tate. I'm stacking defense, which is hard to do, but hear me out here. Rashid Shaheed, who can return punts, which is a defense and special team, so you're getting the double points if something goes bonkers there. Oh, so wow. Shaheed is going in my lineup, and if he gets a punt return for 6, then I'm just printing money left and right. But I'm going with the Saints defense against the Cowboys. You mentioned those matchups earlier, and those are where all the chalk's going to be because we've got some terrible defenses or terrible offenses in the NFL, and that's where most people are going to go with their defenses because it makes sense and the price point is there. But how about the Saints going against the Cowboys? When I'm going with a defense, I want to chase passing volume. Nobody gets fantasy points from a team that runs the ball against you 37 times, right? I mean, even if in a good defensive performance there, it's 3 and out, it's a punt, there's no sacks, there's no turnovers, there's no flips of the script, anything like that. That's not the case in Dallas. Their pass rate over expectation, top 5 in the league last season. The Saints were 3rd in man coverage last week. That frees up plenty of attention or plenty of bodies for them to put on CeeDee Lamb. And if they're doing that, where else is Dak Prescott going with the ball? I'm not sold on Brandon Cooks. We think Jake Ferguson's banged up, doesn't look great for this week. Maybe I pivot if that changes. Jalen Tolbert isn't shocking me here. So if he can't throw to Lamb 13 times, but we know he's going to throw, I think the Saints have more defensive upside than it is kind of suggested, and that the public's going to identify, quite frankly. And if Rashid Shaheed can come through on this stack, then we are cooking. The Saints are the 5th best EPA rush defense on first down. So I think this is going to be a situation where the Cowboys are forced to throw the ball. And not that Dak can't be successful, but he only has to make a mistake or two for this to pay off.
I get that. That's very interesting with the kick returning stack. And one thing I was paying attention to with the new kickoff rules is what teams are actually trying to kick the ball to the opposing kick returner. And one of those teams was the New Orleans Saints, believe it or not. So the Dallas Cowboys with Kevontae Turpin, who did make an impact as a returner in week number 1. The thing is with Turpin, what are you going to get? I mean, Shaheed does give you some snaps on the football field and is a vertical threat and can certainly pay off deep down the football field, and some encouraging things from Derek Carr in week number 1. So I get the double stack there with that. I'm just not messing with the Cowboys offense at home. But for me, the Indianapolis Colts is the one that stands out the most to me. If you're going with Jonathan Taylor, and we expect that this is going to be a game script where, the ball is going to be, run early and often for this Indianapolis Colts offensive unit with Anthony Richardson and Jonathan Taylor. Look, I think Latu is going to have himself a day against this Green Bay offensive line. He is a pass rushing savant. He's the rookie, that first defensive player drafted in the 2024 NFL draft. And it's not as much that the offensive line for Green Bay is terrible. It's that Malik Willis is going to make them look terrible.
The guy behind the offensive line that's the problem.
Yes, exactly. And Malik Willis holds and holds and holds and holds the football. He has 0 career passing touchdowns. He has 3 career interceptions. Every 4.4 passing attempts, he gets sacked. That's just who he is. And maybe Matt LaFleur got his hands on him and can construct the perfect game plan to maximize Malik Willis. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think eventually the Colts offense is going to generate some points. That's going to force Malik Willis to go to the air. And when Malik Willis goes to the air, good things happen for fantasy defenses. So the Colts at $3,300 is one that I'm very, very, very intrigued with. Another one, if you want to kind of go down the board, Soppe, the Cleveland offense looked terrible in week 1. And Deshaun Watson doesn't look right. And they were able to slow down a high-powered and very explosive rushing attack, like I already mentioned, against the Miami Dolphins. If they force Deshaun Watson to go to the air and they don't get it fixed, then the Jacksonville defense at $3,100 is another one that kind of intrigues me, and maybe even the Seahawks against the New England Patriots at $3,000. Some of those options down the board or in the middle range, I'm actually okay with a defense in week number 2.
Yeah, I don't want to say it, but if they shut down the running game like that, is Deshaun Watson just not very, very, very expensive Malik Willis at this point? I mean, we haven't seen anything to really point in a different direction. That might be a little strong, but I like where you're going here. I would go, of the choices you listed, I like the Jags the best when you combine price and ownership.
So Soppe and I are going to compete one-on-one with each other. If you want to join us, hey, go ahead and follow us over on X. Myself at Derek Tate NFL, at Kyle Soppe PFN. And if you have not yet done so, go ahead and subscribe. Hit the like button. Make sure you click the bell so you get the ding, ding, ding every single time we drop a new bit of video content here on the Pro Football Network YouTube channel. And however you digest your podcast, go ahead and subscribe. Leave us a review. We really appreciate all the love and support. If you have any questions when it comes to your fantasy football matchup, we have a PFN Fantasy Discord that you can join so you can interact with myself, Soppe, and Jason Katz. And Jason Katz is always in there answering questions. It feels like he is a godsend doing God's work over on the Discord. But also, you can check out all of our analysis, our rankings, our pickups, our start sits entering week number 2 over at profootballnetwork.com/fantasy. For Kyle Soppe, I'm Derek Tate. And until next time, everybody, later, says a Tater.